actually, before lifting off into the visual material, I want right now to urge you, if you are interested in responsive to poetry, to be aware that Michelangelo, who's about 300 poems of his still survive, and you can buy and get in the library collections of his poetry. It's extraordinarily profound, personal, searching about faith, about love of God, love of his craft, love of men, the conflicts he felt in his life. As if you couldn't already sense from just looking at what he produced that there are enormous levels of complexity to this man. There you'll get confirmation if ever you needed it. So I encourage you to look at that. I also wanted to begin with an idea, a fact, that I did not mention last time when we were looking at, especially at the Medici Chapel, which you're seeing here, that he worked on for 1520 to 1534, is one of the other areas of complexity in his life is that, for example, this he did for two popes who were members of the Medici family, Leo X and then Clement VII. He knew those men from the time they were children. This is one of you remember his first foray into sculpture, his first learning was in the so-called gardens of the Medici Palace. And Pope Leo and he were exactly the same age. They were born the same year in Florence. So these are people he's known all his life. They knew him. They knew all about him, in addition to his great fame. And then they were in the position, temporal as well as ecclesiastical authority, that they could order him to do things. They also knew there were limits to what they could order out of him. But there is this level of personal involvement that also is extremely unusual. We'll see then, he has a pope who becomes one of his best friends. So for example, this is Leo X, under which, the thing Leo was really bedeviling Michelangelo with was to create the facade for their parish church in Florence. So he's caring for what Michelangelo can do for him in Florence. And that was just one of the projects that came to total naught after serious accidents, loss of life, great anguish for a year and a half. So there's Leo X, and then here, his nephew, another Medici. These were the two who were compatriots, colleagues in age of Michelangelo. That's the nephew who then becomes Clement VII. And it was minor members of their family who are then totally transformed into these classical heroes in the Medici Chapel. So most of the chapel was done during the years when Clement VII was Pope. And he was mightily concerned with getting this monument to his family installed in the city. Remember, I told you last time that in 1527, when there was a sack of Rome, there was also this great rebellion in Florence where the Medici were expelled from any power, even power behind the scenes. And Michelangelo, as such a fervent patriot, he wanted the Medici out. So Clement VII could very well, instead of dogging Michelangelo to finish the Medici Chapel, he could have had him executed. So that shows something, or betrays, reveals something about the esteem in which Michelangelo's work was held, that these men preferred to have eternally recognizable monuments to their glory produced by Michelangelo than to carry out any perfectly justified personal vendetta against him. But it meant that Michelangelo, the whole time he was working on this tomb, did feel a kind of under pressure because of that kind of tenuous political situation that he was in. So Clement was having him do this. Clement also had to allow him a few months a year to be going down to Rome. And I'm just mentioning this now because we'll come back to this, because Michelangelo, behind all of these commissions that are just coming at him, and which he readily accepts but just can't complete, has that tomb for Julius II, who is dead. He can't pursue Michelangelo, but the whole family, the Della Rovere family of Julius, is after Michelangelo, and there are numerous court cases. So that's another force at work on him. So, well, Clement VII dies in 1534. And the next pope was Paul III, a different family, the Farnese family, immediately summoned Michelangelo back to Rome. No more work on the Medici tomb. That's why some parts are unfinished, although it seems that Michelangelo has a great comfort with leaving works somewhat unfinished as long as the main lineaments of whatever was to be there were completed. Because Pope Paul III had an idea of what he wanted Michelangelo to be doing. It is something that probably was in Clement's mind as well, because Clement was, when he was saying, oh, yes, you can go work on the tomb in Rome a few months a year, he also had in mind that he wanted Michelangelo to decorate a wall in the Sistine Chapel so that there would be something of his legacy in Rome, not just in his hometown. Well, Pope Paul, when he came, immediately appointed Michelangelo master painter, sculptor, and architect of all the Vatican palaces. So you should know what his prestige was by then. And his main immediate interest was to have Michelangelo do the Sistine Chapel wall behind the altar, which is where the Last Judgment is. So there's, of course, his portrait. This is by Titian. So again, looking at the 15th century view of it, it would have been this wall. So when Michelangelo did the Last Judgment, he also had to close off these windows and essentially paint over what these things were down here. He also had made a very clever, I'll just say clever, change to the wall, that he had the brick thickened up here so that the top of the wall leans into the chapel a little bit, so that whatever he painted up there would be more easily seen from the ground, and also so that dirt wouldn't adhere, that it would just drop right down. Very practical. So here we have what he does, the Sistine Ceiling, which is from 1534 to 1541, and was done single-handedly except for the two assistants. Lacking the knowledge of showing how to show things split screen, want to sort of lay out what where the details are that we're going to be looking at when we look at this. I will have some of the very topmost scenes where there are angels who are carrying away elements of Christ's torture and death. There's the cross over here in the column to which he was tied over here. And then you enter almost a different celestial realm here. Christ as the judge with his mother cleaving to his side. These are the people in heaven, the elect. The saints, we'll look at some, they're quite large. That's the only thing that really differentiates them from everybody else. But these are probably more ordinary people, and there's something very audacious and interesting he does. Of course, he's showing things as if it's flat, you're rising from the ground and you're going up to heaven. But he's also showing it as if it were the illusion of going back in space, because these are quite small figures. So it's as if the elect stretch way back beyond what we can see, and they're crowned all the way to the edges of the picture. So this world where judgment is taking place is only centered on what's present in this fresco scene, and you have to consider it as extending beyond in all areas. Now, as is traditional, conventional, I think obligatory, the people the elect, those who are in heaven or to be chosen to go to heaven, are always at Christ's right, and the damned are at his left, because, well, you remember the word for left is sinister, a reminder that anything to the left was thought to be evil. And then, so you have these people who have been through judgment, the decision has been made, and then in the space between the relatively featureless landscape from which the dead are rising over here, and these are people who are gradually being pulled up by non-terrestrial forces up toward heaven, or here people who are tumbling down toward hell. And hell will be represented, actually, it's quite minimal. It's just the flames of hell over here. But these are the damned. So I will show you these two sections. This figures here. This St. Bartholomew. The angels calling people up from the ground. I think I have two views of the elect and 2 or 3 of the damned. Now, what was very unusual is that, not this scene, I mean, this is traditional in medieval art, but here's the more earlier Catholic art. And this is the scale. So here the Pope would be officiating, and this is the scene that people would be seeing. See, in churches, ordinarily, that's where you put heavenly Jerusalem. It should be full of all the radiance of what you expect, not the actual scene of judgment. And so I'll say a little more about why that's so. But let's look at the conventional ones first. Say, this is a late 11th century church in France. This was quite standard. You put the Last Judgment on the exterior of a church, because the town square where market day affairs would be going on down here and life went on every day, it reminded people, it's a hortatory lesson that every day, be good, be obedient, be Christian, or you're going to go to hell. And this was a conventional way of showing the sense of one of the differences between heaven and hell. Heaven was very orderly, and hell is chaos. So Giotto, inside the Arena Chapel, then brought it indoors. But this is, again, as you're leaving the church, so you have that vision impressed on you to carry you through your activities until you return to church. and again, it's a very orderly sequence, partition of the saved, those already the saints, serried ranks of saints up here, and then the damned in the flowing rivers of hell, but that also is chaotic as opposed to the calm here. See. So why put it here? Well, it was part of the changing theology of the time. We're moving into the era of the Reformation, where Martin Luther and others are calling for radical reform of the church, or thinking that's not possible, to abandon the church and develop the Protestant sects. But the Catholic Church kind of went two ways. One was to stress the graciousness of God, the promise of hope. And then ultimately the one that wins out that in the Counter-Reformation is the need to follow Catholic precepts, Catholic dogma, be obedient Catholic, or otherwise you face damnation. So this is really, as you look at it, it's much more emphatically about the possibility of salvation than it is damnation. As I say, here's just this little tiny bit of hell over here. Although these are people who are going to hell. But this is small compared to all of this. And it's also just the image of Christ here. His right hand is, as it were, raising, lifting up even those who are on his left side, and his left or damning side hand is held back. So it's a typical Michelangelo, through gesture, through the way the body turns. You get both the popes and Michelangelo's personal theology of God as a God of salvation. Okay, well, let's look at the extraordinary image of Christ. And there's something extraordinary that I'll say right now, because I think that applied to this one too. At the end of Michelangelo's life, when the tide had turned and it was much more the retributive justice, retribution rather, the idea of the Inquisition was strong, and the possibility of damnation. There was a lot, well, even by the time this chapel was unveiled to people in the mid-40s, that tumult of all that nudity was just a stew of nudes, was so improper. And there was a hue and cry to destroy the whole fresco. And that's something Michelangelo had to tolerate hearing. He would be helpless to do anything about it in his last years. And that certainly made his last years more anguished than they would have been otherwise. But right after he died, someone who was actually a good friend and a pupil of Michelangelo was hired to come in and repaint two figures, a female saint who had been shown nude, and that was like absolutely not allowed. And another one had to be changed a little. But this poor guy, forever afterwards, had the nickname of just being called Pants, because whenever you find these absolutely absurd little bits of drapes over the genitals, well, that's what he had to do. That's not Michelangelo. But what an unconventional Christ, right? Well, it's a very much a high Renaissance Catholic Christ, where there was a sense that ancient classical thinking and Christian thinking were perfectly congruent. And say, Plato always talked about a God. Had there only been Jesus alive in his lifetime, he would have believed in Jesus and in Christianity. So they saw a kind of a natural flow from one to the other. So for them, it made sense that you could use a powerful figure like the Belvedere torso, or for the face. Now, if you're familiar with classical art, long, straight nose, strong, square chin, tells you right away that comes from Greek art. Or, see, is that a vengeful god? Hardly. He partly uses the head of that Apollo Belvedere that he had seen being brought up from the soil in Rome. Because look, I guess I have to use that. The long curls at the back and the curly locks, and it's the way it's sort of at the top, faintly at the top, like that. So it's a Christ Apollo. And Apollo was the god of light, and light is enlightenment, and God is light, true light. So it was a sympathy. So then these are angels. How would you know they were angels? Certainly not because of any wings. They are simply beautiful, young male figures. This one, I believe, was clothed, but see these little bits of stuff. Oh, that's ridiculous. You do wonder how that man was able to conceive of so many variations in pose for the human figure. And this one, we have the drawing. I believe it was while he was working on the cartoons for this in his, really pokey house that he had in the workers' quarters in Rome. The Pope and 10 cardinals came to visit him to see what he was doing. So greatly interested were they, and so worthy did they consider him, and so truculent was he. Now, he wasn't going to go to them, they had to come to him. Then of the saved, the elect, first crowding around him are well-known saints primarily. And I have a slide that will show you two of them together. This is John the Baptist, considered the last of the Old Testament prophets. And he has a fur cloak behind him. It doesn't cover him, but he has a fur cloak to identify him in his life in the wilderness, wearing furs and living on locusts and honey. And then here's St. Peter. He's handing back the keys to the kingdom because he no longer has, his job on earth is finished. Look how various every one of these, not only in pose, but in facial expression. Let's go way back. And then we'll be looking at this. This is St. Bartholomew, and this is St. Lawrence. They have attributes. St. Lawrence was martyred by being, well, let's just put really blunt summer language. He was grilled. So that was the grill on which he was killed. And Bartholomew was skinned. So here he has the skinner's knife, and he holds an empty skin. But there is that, just as you saw that with the ceiling, how as he went along, the figures move farther and farther away from normative human proportions. So the heads are getting quite small. And it's, although they're full of expression, it's the bodies that dominate. You see right here, don't you? That's the seam between one day's work and the next. So that, oh, no, head takes more work. Better save that for a separate day. We can do this in a more generalized way, and more of it more rapidly. And Bartholomew. It was from that time always accepted that this is Michelangelo's self-portrait. So you need to think of the implications of that, where all of life, all of character lies in powerfully muscled, active bodies. He's nothing but a skin. So that's the most abject humility, a kind of a spiritual abasement. And as I did say at the end last time, well, Raphael and he were both being called divine at the time. It might be partly his working against the sense of taking pride in his accomplishments, in pride in being called the divine, his his arrogance over what he could do, since otherwise he would never have that nose smashed in when he was a kid. But this was not unique to him. This is another Last Judgment by a Florentine artist 20 years before. And I'm going to look at this and this. It's the artist's self-portrait. Clearly had troubles with lust for ladies. But how caricatured, how comic those are compared to the figures we see. We'll see in this. So these are the angels rousing the dead. And the angels here, this one, his eyes are just going to bug out of his head. They're blowing as much noise as possible to get the figures over here. Then it's very restrained on the side over here. The book is large. This is the angel holding the book of their deeds, and they would have many misdeeds. The book of the saved is quite small. And the dead rise. And as they rise from, I don't think there are any actually that are just pure skeleton. I think that would be just so, well, no, here's one right here. So antithetical to this man who believes in the enfleshed body. But when there are bodies, as they rise out of the ground, they still have the pallor of death. They don't have blood coursing through them. Nor can they do much on their own. Oh yeah, here's another skeleton. But as they rise, their blood returns. And they have help. This would be an angel. Here's an angel. There's some angels up here. This is a very complicated cluster. This gorgeous, smiling angel here. One man clinging to him, one man upside down, and someone frantically trying to still sort of get along on that too by pulling on the hair of this one. You see his face down here. So they're endowed with character right away. This one, there's the snakes from the underworld. And he's still very much a eviscerated body, being so tenderly brought up and lifted up. And as they go up, You see the variation in their facial expressions as their character returns to them as well. And again, they're angels who assist. This is a couple who are being brought up on a rosary. So they're clearly rising because of their faith. I don't know how this one managed to get by without any drapery. And the damned, by and large, fall from their self-recognition of what they've done. There are angels up here. They're not actually doing anything so punitive. They're rushing at them, but they're not doing much. This is the one that's almost like a statement, because here's a man of still powerful physique. He's looking inward. He sees what he's done. He knows his fate. He doesn't object. And the gleeful demons, who still look extraordinarily like human beings with the vilest possible character, but they don't really look like monsters. And here's a detail that, my goodness, got the Reforming Church in a tizzy, because this detail comes out of Dante rather than any biblical theology. It shows the classical idea of crossing the river Styx. So this would be Charon, the boatman who takes the dead across. And in a minute, the next, I can't see it here, but I think you can, over at the very edge, there is a man with a snake wrapped around him. That's Minos, who stands in instead of Satan. So that, well, Michelangelo adored Dante and wrote a lot of poetry in the style of Dante. So it's again that sense of that continuity between and perfect adequacy of using something from classical antiquity for this Christian theme. See, look at this. He's jumping. He knows he belongs, going on his own, stepping over on his own. They don't look too different from the figures he used for the Battle of Cascina for the Florence Town Hall when he was younger. And there's Minos. Well, now I introduce and will interweave a little more that tomb for Julius II. This is again a picture of Julius II, who was the one who insisted Michelangelo come to Rome in 1505, leaving his beloved Florence because of Julius's grand plans to abandon the hallowed old St. Peter's as far too small, to build a brand new church and also to build a brand new tomb. He was thinking about his tomb when he still had 8 years of his life left. But and this tomb was going to be placed against a wall in the Church of St. Peter's. And the difference in scale, I showed you that before. He will give the job for designing the church first to a man named Donato Bramante, a colleague and not particularly close friend of Michelangelo's. But he wanted Michelangelo working on the tomb, and it's clear that it would take a while for something so ambitious, and it was going to take a while to build this building. So this is the idea that Michelangelo and the Pope agreed on first. One fact to keep in mind over all of this, it took 40 years for Michelangelo to complete this. I just think in my own life, how much of my work life, how much things changed in the span of 40 years. But not only did it take 40 years, but he went from something where he planned to have 40 life-size and over life-size figures in a structure that was 30-some feet high with an interior chapel to something that had only 6 figures. So he's going to be battered by the family that wants this tomb finished, by other popes who keep pulling him off to do other things, by his own tendency to do other things, because he said, oh, I can do this in 7 years. Well, then he went out and immediately took another commission. No way he was going to get this done in 7 years, but he was getting paid a monthly salary, and that mattered, a handsome salary. But the original idea was to have something more or less like this. On the bottom, these were probably virtues. And these are the figures now, we call them slaves. When he talked about them, he just called them prisoners. And then there would be prophets and sibyls, just as at the Sistine Ceiling. And then above that, there would be sort of angels carrying an image of the dead Julius. So he's risen above all of life. Now, where did the idea for this come, like, especially with these prisoners? Well, classical antiquity. The Arch of Constantine, where at the top, there are figures here that represent captives from an area that's actually Yugoslavia. So Julius saw no irreconcilable conflict between the theme of a Roman emperor and then what he wanted as a memorial for himself. There's two of the conflict. And this is an early drawing for when he starts working on this. So these drawings are 15.5, 15.6 maybe. And he's actually, no, this has to be later at 15.8, because these are some of his ideas for figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And he's playing around with different possible poses for those prisoners. And 2 of the prisoners from that time survive. And they're the ones in the Louvre that you see here. They're now so-called the dying slave and the bound slave. So we know, we assume they didn't have that. And the slaves to what? That's like the nudes on the ceiling. It's not possible to define now all the implications these had for them. But we just look at these 2 figures. These were done 15, 13, 15, 16. Things were already slowing down because the money was going into the building of the church, but he was still working on it. And these are, you can see they're big. The figures are about 7 feet high. And these here pretty well finished. So this is a very soft, sensuous figure, quite languorous in a fixed and free leg pose. One has to imagine there's a dream, a very happy dream. And then the one called the bound slave, well, he does have a kind of a strap binding him here. And this is original, this over here. And he has a much more muscular body and a conflicted pose. See there, or here. So whoever they are, they have to express a whole range of humanity's possible feelings. Well, so that had to stop work, partly because the Pope died and his family didn't immediately get after Michelangelo. And then the next popes want him working up in Florence on the Medici Chapel. Then they had to come up with another, finally actually altogether there were at least 4 different contracts. The scale of it was whittled down, but this is one of the next ideas that Michelangelo had for it. He's changing the upper levels, still keeping the idea of the slaves. And this is Michelangelo's drawing. This again be like, these would be victory figures with people at the base. That comes in the things like the Arch of Constantine as well. But he did do 4 more nudes, and he did them in Florence while he was simultaneously working on the Medici Chapel. And now these were truly unfinished. And they have nicknames. So let me be sure that I give you the right nickname for them. The one here on the left, that's the awakening slave. This is the young slave or prisoner. So they're different ages, but so, to my mind, so interesting to see revealed something you already knew. That what interested me is the body overall, not the face. And you see the way he works the marble. There's the front of the block of marble. Then he hacks away and hacks away. You might be familiar with a saying that he thought to be his, that he says, when he's cutting marble, he's like finding lowering the bath water and finding the figure emerge. But he had to have a sense in that dimensions of the block exactly how to fit the figure, or it's going to be wasted and he'll have to do something else with it. He did sometimes, but other sculptors did very frequently make either a wax model or a kind of a clay model, so they could have a referent at scale and then carve the marble so that it worked with that. But he seems to have done without that, mainly. Just see what could be done as he worked on it. And you can see the progress of which tools he does. Now, this is completely finished, a muscle. It's finished to the point where it has finally been smoothed with the pumice. So it will have almost like a waxy finish. Here's a claw chisel, then the finer chisel, the rougher one here. It's just worked with a mallet and chisel there. This is a bearded slave. See, he doesn't leave much of the block left, even at the bottom. And so-called eyeless, this one, he hasn't done the head at all. There's the edge of the block. So these are 8.5 feet high. Now I'm thinking of this man. He has unfinished sculpture in Rome. He has unfinished sculpture here. And many more to do. So then finally, 1532, the Della Rovere affair. When the Della Rovere, Julius's family would be pursuing Michelangelo, successive popes would say, no, we free him from all responsibility. He has to work for us. So there's all this kind of struggle going on in the background. And then finally, Michelangelo does from 1532 on to 1545, he's more or less working with 2 assistants on it. Now, Moses was done before that, early with those first slaves, but we're going to look at different. And he probably had finished Julius by then. But it's moved. It's not in St. Peter's. It's put in the Church of St. Peter's in Chains, which was Pope Julius's home parish church. And to make it look more as if it were like something big and monumental, he opened a huge space, a window up here. So it's as if there'd be space behind it. Well, that was a risky move, but he did it. So here's the Pope. So different, although elderly there, but look at his conception of him. And I believe I brought in, look at his hands. Since we know how much hands mean to Michelangelo, of course, this would be seen higher up. Always planned on that. The aged, weary, contemplative man who terrified millions, was a great military leader. And that's all behind him. And then the Moses. This is that biographer that I keep talking about. This is based on his research, and he was involved in the restoration, cleaning up of this statue, where they even discovered some of the original marble dust in here from Michelangelo's time. The figure has to have been finished early on, and then Michelangelo has reworked it. And how would you know he's reworked it? He's reworked it into a pose that is what to many people makes this famous, because this mighty Moses here with the tablets of the law. He's seen the Israelites have disobeyed him, and they're at the base of the mountain. They've made the golden calf. So he comes down and he's looking at them with all his ferocity that was shared also with the Pope and with Michelangelo, and that he will crash these tablets to the ground, that he's looking at them. And the new discovery is, oh no, that head has been reworked, and this whole side of the figure has been reworked. Now, why would you do that? Originally, the pose would have been something like this Sybil with the feet side by side, instead of 1 foot way back, as if he's about to turn and twist and rise in fury off his chair. Now, the biographer suggests, and I think there's there's some controversy, but not a lot. Michelangelo wanted to turn the head because it was facing over toward a chapel that presented the concept of the deity that was the vengeful deity, so against what Michelangelo and his circle of deep believers called the spirituals, a man who almost became Pope, a fine woman, poetess, theologian. I mean, he was moving in very high realms in this, that he did not want Moses to be confronting that. So he averts the head. So that's the theory anyway. So what's the evidence? Well, we'll look at some things that are a little bit strange. For one thing, look how small that leg is. If that's the kneecap compared to this. And look at how puny this side of the beard is compared to this. So he's changed the pose, changed this, and cut that whole form out of what was originally a leg forward. And all the rest is this related to turning the figure. I hope you know about the horns. That's standard in the iconography for Moses. It's a mistranslation of a word for Moses when he had conversations with God, that light radiated from his face, and that word they translated as horns. But see, look at that. Once you know, it's like, oh my goodness, isn't that ridiculous? Look at that little bit there. compared to this, which he just rakes his hand through in that gesture that is so typical in his work. The arms could stay the same. It's the leg that had to change. So there's always something to be learned from further looking at these figures. Well, he finally finished 1545. 1546, the Pope appoints him to complete St. Peter's. Oh, and St. Peter's didn't look as it does now. This is done after his lifetime. But Michelangelo worked as chief architect for St. Peter's until his death in 1564. He had done and provided designs and overseen some architecture before, but this is a sign of the enormous influence he wielded, and also he faced a lot of enmity about this, because over the years, there had been successive architects working on it, each one changing the plan as each pope changed the plan. This was the original one for the new St. Peter's. It was going to look a lot like a Christianized version of the Pantheon, a perfectly domed building with towers on each corner, perfectly symmetrical, I think, in every way. And while Bramante was still alive, at least enough was done that these big arches to hold the dome were in place. Well, that put paid. That means you've got to work for that. Any church is going to have to build from there. And they do. They're different architects. Raphael worked on this for a while. Another trained architect named Sangallo did. This is the original plan, changed plan, Michelangelo's plan. Now, I don't know that you're going to go into raptures about an architectural plan, but if you look around just the outer surface, that's like looking at the flesh on one of those muscular nudes. Everything moves in and out and in and out and in and out. And it's pulled together and tight, not these like separate sort of cubicle spaces. Oh, Michelangelo, I hated the guy who did this. He said, oh, that's a place, and there's going to be so many dark areas in there. That's where there can be all sorts of thievery going on, and nuns would be made pregnant, and he really carried on. So when Michelangelo got it and says, all right, this has to go. This had all of this. This is huge, a lot of architecture. He had it destroyed. But that was his authority. They did it. This was the main source of graft in Rome, was the contractors working on this. And Michelangelo said, there will be no graft, no theft. I have to see every bill. I have to see everything that's done. And Michelangelo, his authorized biographer said, oh, he did this all for no money. It is true he did this as his gift to God, but he was also given a salary. See, this is the plan he hated. I hate it too. I think it's like, oh my goodness. So now what is of his is the confirmation of part of the interior. And this exterior back wall is his, and probably most of the dome. It's not quite certain. He's still tinkering with that, with designs when he died, whether that was to be a semicircle or like the dome in his hometown in Florence, and to come to a point. See, there's nothing solid, nothing stolid. It all multiplies and moves in and out. Lots of windows. It's very expressive. Really, painters. Well, I'm glad we do have time. We have 5 minutes. For something that he was working on, he's still carrying out multiple other commissions, and he's an old man now. All his brothers were dead. His dad had died. That was probably not such a bad thing for him. He had only his nephew, whom he loved dearly. his nephew who wanted to come down and see him and take care of him. And Michelangelo would say persistently, do not come down here. You get in my way. I don't want you around here. Stay away. All you want is my money. And then he would send apologetic poems to him and say, oh, I love you. He did. What Michelangelo was very aware of, and to his learned friends who would say, relax, enjoy your friends, go for walks with us, take a lover. Then his art would sacrifice, that he was fully aware that he had sacrificed every other aspect of his life, his deep needs, except for his spiritual need, to his art. Well, this was a Pietà, now it's called the Bandinelli Pietà for the person, the banker who finally bought it, that Michelangelo worked on from, well, let's see, when was that? About, I have to remember when he started it, I don't remember. I think, well, it was in the 1540s. And 1547 to 1555. It's often talked of as just this, he intended to be the Pietà that was going to go on his tomb in Florence. And of course, you see it's highly unfinished. And it's a very different Pietà, because here, there's Mary. This is Mary Magdalene's. So it's not the conventional, just Mary holding her dead son. This is Nicodemus, the man who helped lower Christ's body from the cross. And that is Michelangelo's self-portrait. And what it is then a presentation of the body. But what happened? It has to be speculation. When it got to this stage, Michelangelo at some point had a fit of frenzy, attacked it with his hammer, broke off the knee, broke parts of the arm, broke several other parts of it, and left it. So one of his biographers said, oh, well, he found a flaw in the material, and that's why he stopped. Well, nonsense. There are other sculptures he did that had flaws in the material, and he finished them. So the thought of this biographer, it's a rather romantic thought, not heart and flower, sense of romance, that there was also a story going on about of Michelangelo sometimes expostulating, like, how could you betray me? Now, if that were a story that was to be addressed to this statue and addressed to Christ, this could be an expression of the most profound spiritual anguish. That in his always irrepressible rage, it now reached titanic levels where he even attacked the image of Jesus. His friends were dead. He was sick. A friend of his just barely escaped with his life from the Inquisition. There was the thought that his Sistine, the Last Judgment, was going to be destroyed. Money that had been given to him on a regular balance. Now the current Pope withdrew that money, which has always been so important to him, that at the end of his life, things were really desperately bad. Let's look at this. This has just been cleaned. This brownish stuff is partly just the filth that comes from wax, because this has been on the altar in the Cathedral of in Florence for a long time. But with two of the restorers next to it, you get the idea of the size. And the really remarkable, all of these figures, it's a single block of marble. Each of these figures rises to a different level. This shows that whole lifetime of being able to calculate where things are in the stone, where you can carve them. And we'll finish with this detail here. Let's see, there's that sense now it's not body anymore. That he's offered, he gives a Christ now that is not a vigorous body, but a Christ that has emptied himself in terms of expressing only spirit, which was the direction of that theology in which Michelangelo was deeply invested. Without finishing the face, without putting in the eyes, that still seems to me just from the sheer angle of the head and the shape of the mouth, extremely expressive. And then the kind dead hand, so gently touching her back. Nicodemus looks off into space, which is looking into himself. And Mary almost merges with her son. So he abandoned that. And up and then later, well, he worked up until 6 days before he died. And in those last days, he was working on another Pietà for himself. He'd taken another sculpture and he'd hacked it away. This is just the arm left from it because it sort of needed to have some balance for what's over here. But this is like a flicker of flame. And this will be my last. All right, any questions before you rush to the TV or the hearing or whatever?
Wow.
Thank you, Maggie.
Yes, well, I'll give you a moment if you need to. I mean, I've had a chance to see looking at this for a while now, just sort of regain my composure because I think they are so overwhelming.
Maggie,
Do any of his tools survive?
I don't think, oh, and I had an anecdote. I got to tell you this anecdote. I don't think we have his tools. His assistants who took some of his work and the marbles that weren't worked would have probably taken them as well. When he died, they spirited his body out of Rome because there would have been enormous fanfare in Rome. And they took it back to Florence. They spirited it out. Leonardo, his nephew, came and got it in a bale of hay. And they took it back to Florence. And when finally his body was exhumed, which was like 20 days after he died, they said there was no odor and there was no decomposition, which was taken as a proof that he was a saint. And when the body arrived in Florence, people streamed out. I don't actually think of like events at Tiananmen Square. People streamed out of all the quarters of the city with candles to follow the procession with that body. So thank you for asking that question. So I remembered that. But no, I don't think we have any of his tools.
Maggie,
Yeah.
any suggestions, recommendations for books that we can read?
Well, I keep recommending this one. I think it's a challenge because it's a very literate book and quite detailed, but I find it so moving. It's by this author named Forcellino, Forcellino. There are many books about Michelangelo. When you're looking at them, probably try to get something that's written by an academic, because there's a lot of popularizing that is essentially to emphasize sheerly the dramatic and emotional part without seeing how completely enmeshed that is with his activity as an artist. Saslow, Saslow is one. Detolnay is another. Man who's written a lot about him. I know more, but they just flipped out of my head. I'm like, I also am eviscerated by looking at these.
I want to thank you for really piquing my interest in wanting to know more and to see more. I've really appreciated these sessions.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, and for me, one of the great pleasures I get is that my specialty was something from classical art when we know nothing about who did it. I worked with clay figurines, and I can see the fingerprints of the people who made them. I can put my finger right there, but I don't know if they're male or female or their age or anything about them. And so to have this is for me wonderful also.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you, Maggie.
Yes.
Much appreciated.
Thank you, Maggie.
And I see there are two chat. Let me see what I got. Well, I'm sure this must be Jeff. Yeah, it is. There's a very short video on Michelangelo's San Lorenzo facade model on YouTube in both Shostakovich and written Michelangelo sonnets to music. Oh, his sonnets are, oh my goodness. And then you get the letters to his brother where he's saying, everybody's taking advantage of me. He encompassed millions of people in his character. There's such a variety. And he had some very loyal friends who recognized his complex, contradictory character and loved him anyway. All right. Well,
What is your next series going to be about? Architecture, something.
oh, this one in the summer. This is just a three week, because architecture, I figure something. Actually, it's a way to sneak in a Gothic cathedral. It's going to be the ideal cities. Gothic cathedrals, supposedly their design is based on the concept of what heavenly Jerusalem looked like. And then Leonardo designed a new plan for Milan. And then I thought we'd do Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, who wanted modern industrial cities where they're total nightmares of skyscrapers and no greenery. So that's what it'll be. All right, anyone else? Goodbye.
Thank you, Maggie. Bye.
Oh,
Bye. Thank you.
my thanks to you as well.